Good morning. Good morning. Okay, you all are awake. Just wanted to make sure. It's good to have all of you here this morning. We have several of our ladies that are at a retreat this weekend. They will be back later on this afternoon. So that's where some of them are. I do want to remind you, and I'll try to remember to remind you again, look for you back at 1:30 this afternoon. Through the winter months, we're going to be meeting at 1:30 on Sundays. And so keep that in mind. Make your plans to be back. This afternoon at 1:30, we're going to be talking about salt. And so that's our topic for this afternoon. If you want to know what the Bible says about salt, do a little reading between now and then as you're eating your lunch, what the Bible has to say about salt. Again, thank all of you for all of the hard work that you put in to make last Sunday a success. I think the fish fry and then our homecoming was a success, and we're looking forward again to that next year. And we're going to, I think, make that an annual thing. So looking forward to that. Last 3 Sundays prior to last Sunday, we've been talking about Colossians chapter 3. And I think I've decided I really wish I'd have started in Colossians chapter 1 when I started this. But we may go back and pick it up after we get to Colossians chapter 4. But we're talking about being hidden with Christ. And just as kind of a quick review to help us to get our minds back on track, I want us to kind of look at what we've talked about. Remember in Colossians chapter 2, it talks about putting off that old man, putting on the new man, and driving out those evil thoughts. And so once we do that, we are to, in chapter 1 or chapter 3, verse 1 of chapter 3 tells us to seek those things which are above. And when we find those things that are above, looking to Christ and looking to God, we are to set our minds on what is above. So focus on living for God. Focus on what God would have us to do in our life. Focus on God's Word. Set our mind on things above. Have our goal as being in heaven with God when this life is over. Then in verse 2 he says, because you died to the world. That old man of sin was put to death. The new man was raised to walk in newness of life. And because we have put off that old man and we have died, then we are hidden with Christ. When God looks at me, when God looks at you, what He needs to see is not see you, but see Jesus. Then in verse 4, then when that prepares us for when Christ who comes back, then when Christ appears, who is our life, Christ who guides our life, when God looks at us, He sees Christ. So Christ who is our life, when He appears in glory, then we can appear with Him in glory. We can be with Him. We will be changed to be like Him. Remember, Paul said, it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And that's the way that you and I need to spend our life. Verse 5 tells us that we put to death those members. We put to death those evil things that were in our life. We put those things out of our life so they do not exist any longer. But when we put those out of our life, because the wrath of God is coming on those who do not, those who are disobedient, God, the wrath is going to... Have you ever thought about facing the wrath of God? What a terrifying thought that could be. Facing the wrath of God. The God who said, or in the beginning, created the heavens and the earth, and spoke everything into existence. That kind of power, facing that power's wrath. That should be a motivator in itself, let alone the love that we have for God. But that's coming on the sons of disobedience, those that do not obey. We put off, not only do we put off those other sins that he talked about in verse 5, but we put off these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie one to another, since you put off those deeds. Put off those things. So get those things out of your life. And then he tells us to put on the new man. Remember, Jesus said that when an evil demon goes out of a man, he walks to and fro seeking a new home. When he doesn't find it, he walks through the dry places. When he doesn't see anything, he gets 7 other demons and he goes back to where he was at the first time. If he finds that house clean and swept and empty, he comes back and moves right back in. But as Christians, when we put off that old man, we empty our lives of those sin, we need to put something back in its place. Or those things are going to creep back in. So what are we to put in its place? Let's go on to verse 12. We are the elect of God. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, the elect of God. But you put on tender mercies, compassion, have a heart of compassion. And you put on kindness, putting that compassion to work. I can look at you and have compassion on you, but if I sit back and don't do nothing, where's my kindness? If I see somebody in need and say, well, I feel sorry for you, I have compassion for you, but I don't do anything. I say be warmed and filled and go your way. Where's my kindness? And then humility, being humble, understanding that without Jesus I am nothing. Without God in my life, I am nothing. I can accomplish nothing without God in my life. Meekness, being in control is what meekness is. Having that control. And then long suffering, being patient with one another. Now, he says here to put those things in your life. Put those in your life. Fill the gap where you put out the worldly things out of your life. Fill that gap with goodness. And here's the ones you put in your life. It kind of reminds me of Galatians chapter 6 in the fruits of the Spirit. Remember the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are the things that you and I need to put in our life. If you think about the examples here, this should remind us of that. The fruits of the Spirit. Here we're talking about putting on these things like a garment. But then the outcome of that is the fruits of the Spirit. Now, as we're talking about this here, putting on tender mercies, kindness, humility, and meekness and long suffering. Well, now, how do I do that? How do I let that show? How do I put on those things in my life where people can see it? Now, or am I to do it and try to hide it? Or am I to do it and let people see it? Jesus says, let your light so shine that men may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So we need to do those things so people can see. How do I do that? Well, let's carry right on into verse 13. Bearing with one another. Bearing with one another. The little things that I do that get on your nerves. I just thought of this. I've been fussed at sometimes for when I'm doing announcements, clicking my ink pen. Bear with me on those things. Those things that we do. Now, it's different when we sin. But bear with each other for our little idiosyncrasies that we do that bother us. But now, let's take it a little bit deeper than that, because I think it's a little bit deeper than that. I think this one is akin to meekness. If you say something that hurts my feelings, that bothers me, what is my first reaction? You remember, if you go back to meekness in chapter 12, and we looked at the example of meekness being gentleness. Some translations say that as gentleness. Having the power or the strength to strike back, but not doing it. You say something to me that hurts my feelings, Man, I've got one better that I can come back at you and hurt you worse than you hurt me. But forbearing with each other is holding back, is me or you holding back. Being in control. Remember we talked about meekness, that horse 2 weeks ago we talked about, it was in reference to the Greek, a horse, a strong, powerful horse, but yet he was meek, he was under control. And when someone says something to you that hurts your feelings, be in control. That's what bearing with one another means. And how can I bear with someone if I have not put on humility? You see, that garment in verse 12 helps me to accomplish these things in verse 13. If I put on humility, then I understand, well, yeah, he said that. Maybe he's having a bad day. Just let it go. Don't worry about it. You ever heard the saying, like water rolls off a duck's back? Just let it go. Now, yeah, I could strike back. I could come back with a zinger, but I'm not going to. I'm going to let it go. That's what it means bearing with one another. That's the deeper meaning than just the little things that I may do that bother you. Just let those things go. And who will be better for it? Who will be better for it when you let that go? You will be. Because chances are I may never know that clicking my ink pen when I'm making announcements in the microphone gets on people's nerves. Now I understand that's not a real good example, but you understand what I mean. Just let it go. And then the easy one is next. Forgiving one another. Forgiving one another. Isn't that easy? Isn't that easy to do? Just, hey, I forgive you. That's kind of difficult sometimes. But you remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 in his Sermon on the Mount? Unless you forgive your brother his trespasses, your Father in heaven will not forgive you of your trespasses. What does that mean? What does it mean when Jesus says, if I don't forgive you, then God's not going to forgive me? Folks, it means exactly what it says. If I'm not willing to be forgiving, then God is not going to forgive me. I have to take the initiative to forgive. I have to be willing to forgive. How many times, the question might be asked, how many times do I need to forgive you? Well, we've got the answer to that. What did Jesus tell his disciples? In a day's time, you forgive your brother 490 times. 7 times 70. You forgive him. In a day's time, in one day, you forgive him. Every time. Sometimes we want to see people grovel. Well, I know what they done to me. And so what I need to see you come down, and I need to see you grovel and beg for forgiveness. Who deserves forgiveness? If you think about it, if you think about forgiving one another, if you drop down, I think it's verse 16, where we're singing psalms and hymns to one another. You notice the one another there? Who's supposed to be doing that? All of us. When we're singing, who's supposed to be singing? Every single one of us. Now, That's the same phrase right there that's right here. Go back to verse 13, Tim. That's the same phrase, one another. Who's to be doing that? Who's to be forgiving? Every single one of us. All of us forgive. May not be easy. Probably won't be easy. But do you think it was easy for Jesus to be nailed to a cross? Do you think it was easy for Jesus to do what he did? You know, sometimes we think, well, you know, these things are not really easy for me to do. May not be. But you look at what Jesus did for us. And he says that, if you go down to the bottom part of that verse, just as Christ forgave you. How much has Christ forgiven you? That's how much. That's a measuring stick there. As Christ forgave you. You remember when Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, that you love your brother as I have loved you. That's the new part of that commandment. Love your brother, love your neighbor was given unto Moses in the Ten Commandments. But what's new about what Jesus says? He's the measuring stick. As I have loved you. And we are to forgive as Christ forgave us. We forgive and we forget. That's what you and I need to do. It's what God does. May not be easy, but that's what we're to do. Then the next phrase in that. If anyone has a complaint against one another. That don't happen in the church, does it? It doesn't happen, does it? Nobody has a complaint against their brother in the church. Well, folks, it does sometimes. Well, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do when that happens? Well, I'm going to go over here and get my friends, and I'm going to tell them all that you've done to me. I'm not going to tell you, but I'm going to tell them all that you've done to me. And then I'm going to get them to tell me all that you've done to them. And then together, we're going to have a great big pity party. How bad I've been treated. Is that what he's saying right here? You've got a complaint against another. What are you supposed to do? Forgive it. That's what he's saying. Now, Jesus tells us that if we have a problem with our brother, go talk to him. Work it out. Between you and them. And then if that can't be worked out, then there's guidelines for us to do. You take a couple with you. And then you take the elders in the church. So we've got a process to work that out. But be forgiving. And all of these things that he's talking about here, being forgiving, bearing with each other, forgetting those little idiosyncrasies that I have, the things that you do that irritate me to death. I'm going to let those go. Those are so much easier to do if we are clothed with those things that are mentioned in verse 12. If we do all of those things, it's so much easier to forgive. It's easier to bear with one another. It's easier to get along. Now, folks, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to brag on you just a little bit. For the past several years, you all have gotten along very, very well. And you are to be commended for that. You show love for one another. You show concern for one another. You show care for one another. And Dennis and I have talked about it on numerous occasions. How well things are going here at Hardin for the last several years. Yeah, there's been bumps in the road. But things are going well. And you are to be commended for that. Because that tells me and tells Dennis and tells the world that you have clothed yourself with those things that God has told us to. We're getting along like a family of God. So be forgiving of each other. Be caring about each other. Let those little things, let them slide. Let them go away. But now, I want you to look at what he says in verse 14. But above all of these, put on love. Reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Without love, no matter what you do, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we read Paul saying there, no matter what you do, if you give all that you have to the poor, you give your body to be burned, you give your life for God, but you don't have love, you're an annoyance. We talked about this verse last Wednesday night in the young adult class. And I remember, and a lot of them did not remember Longhorn Leghorn. You remember the rooster in the cartoon? And the little chicken hawk? He would say, "Go away, boy, you bother me." If you don't have love, no matter what you do, go away, boy, you bother me. You're an annoyance. Love has to be the key. You know, down in verse 6 of chapter 13, I think maybe it's verse 7. Love bears all things. Love bears all things. Go back to verse 13 of Colossians chapter 3. Bearing with one another. Why am I bearing with you? Why am I putting up with those things? Because here in verse 14, I put on love. I love you, so I'm going to bear with you. Our clothing, as we've talked about here, has to be put on with the belt of love. Love holds it all together. Notice what he says here. But above all these things, put on love, which is the what? The bond of perfection. It brings all of these together. It completes all of these things. And it makes all of these characteristics easier and complete. We put on that bond of love. That's what holds us together. What holds you together as a family? Love. What holds us together as a congregation? Love. And our desire to please God. Now we're going to continue this next week. And we're going to go on through the chapter. And we're going to stay in this till we complete the book of Colossians. One more chapter. But there may be 2 or 3 more lessons coming. But the question for you this morning is, what garments do you have on? Have you taken off those worldly garments and put on those heavenly garments? And are your heavenly garments, if you have put them on, Remember, that's what Paul talked about. Being raised to walk in newness of life. Put off that old man, put on the new man. Have we gotten those spiritual garments dirty? Because we can do that. We can get our spiritual garments dirty. God knows that. And God made a plan for that. And if you've gotten your spiritual garments dirty, you've been unforgiving. You've not been bearing with one another. Then start doing that. And ask God for forgiveness. And your brothers and sisters in Christ will forgive you. Should forgive you. And if they don't, then that's their problem. But make sure that you are right with God. If you're here and you're not a child of God, you've never obeyed the gospel, you've not taken off those worldly garments, then you need to do that today. You need to put on that new garment and walk in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. This morning, if you're subject to the invitation, I encourage you to come while we stand and while we sing.